Hello everyone! You're gonna need your notebooks today because it's time, once again, for Muggz' MK Classroom. We're continuing our lesson on NISCs, and this time we're headed to Hyrule to tackle a NISC that is very useful, and in my opinion, it's not too difficult. It's the Hyrule Circuit ending NISC. Let's go. Let me first start by saying that if you haven't watched my video on the Swamp Ruins 150cc beginning NISC, you may want to check that one out. In that video, I went over some common shortcut techniques, specifically those for no item shortcuts, that is NISCs. And I tried my best to break everything down to the basics. But more specifically, I outlined 4 skills that will be useful for NISCs in general. Those skills are 1. Building releasing mini turbos during drifts in the off-road. 2. Alignment hopping. 3. Neutral drifting. 4. Soft drifting. I went over the first 2 skills in the last video, so I won't be covering them here. Again, check out my Swamp Ruins NISC video for more details there. That being said, we will need one new skill for this video, but I'll get to that soon enough. First, let's just introduce this NISC, and let's perform it with a mushroom. In doing so, we can pinpoint the location of the NISC and get an idea of the hazards that we will have to consider when executing it without an item. So, as you can see, we're nearing the end of a lap on Hyrule Circuit. We proceed off the ledge as normal, but instead of using the mushroom through the hole in the fence, which is the more obvious mushroom cut, we will use it to cut between this tree and the tower on the right-hand side. Note that I actually slightly bumped into this plant right here. While I basically get away with it, we will see later that about 2-ish laps into the race, a DEKU Baba will sprout here, and if it had already done so, I would have gotten chomped. But once we're back on the main road, we proceed as normal. This is the cut we're going to turn into a NISC. Now, you probably noticed those 2 trees and the protruding tower. They're pretty obvious, and they're complicating factors for this NISC, which we'll see later. Due to their presence, we will have to be pretty precise with our driving lines when approaching this NISC, which is half the challenge here. But before we get into that, I want to discuss the other half of the challenge. But before we get into that, we need to discuss that new skill. And that new skill is neutral drifting. If you watched my last video, you probably recall discussing the basics of drifting, such as the 3 levels of mini turbo we can achieve from drifting, as well as the factors which impact the rate at which those mini turbos charge, amongst some other things. Well, one thing I didn't really mention was neutral drifting. Neutral drifting is pretty simple. It is when you enter a drift as usual, but then let go of the stick, giving no directional input whatsoever on that left stick. This can actually be really useful in a lot of different ways. First off, when you are in a neutral drift, you will take turns at a tightness that is in between that of a hard drift and that of a drift in which you have the stick 90 degrees in the opposite direction in which you are turning. Also, when in neutral drift, your mini turbos charge at the slower of the 2 rates that I mentioned in the last video, so do keep that in mind. While those 2 effects of neutral drifting are quite important, there is another effect that is vital to this Hyrule Circuit NISC. The third effect of neutral drifting is that, when jumping while in a neutral drift, your kart seemingly jumps a greater distance. While I couldn't find anything definitive on why jumping in neutral drift does this, it may be because it maximizes the kart's forward momentum. But regardless as to the reasons why this works, trust me when I say that jumping while in neutral drift position really does help you jump further in the desired direction. Or don't trust me at all, actually, and go test it out for yourself. Get out there and experiment. It's just that I personally found this upcoming NISC I'm about to show very difficult to impossible to perform without jumping while in a neutral drift. But yeah, so that's neutral drifting. When playing at a more advanced level, neutral drifting will come into play in a variety of situations, whether it's to take optimal lines or perform these NISCs like I mentioned, etc. But for our purposes here, we now know everything we need to know about neutral drifting, so we are ready to tackle this NISC. Oh, and first off, I suggest starting as Wario or Waluigi on a Wiggler with roller tires and paper glider. This was the setup I had the least trouble doing this NISC with, although to be honest, once you get the field down, it isn't terribly difficult to generalize to most other setups, except the inward drifting bikes. Right now I have virtually no skills with these bikes, so if you do use an inward drifting bike, then this tutorial won't be of much help. But in the future, I do intend on trying to address various NISCs while using inward drifting bikes, so keep an eye out for that in the future. Oh, and one final note to mention, which you probably noticed when I took the cut with the mushroom, but if we're racing online, taking this NISC or this cut in general bypasses the item set, which means you won't get any items. So just, keep in mind the situation you're in while during your race, and if you need items and feel like, it's worth the time, go out and get those items. But if not, this NISC really can help you a lot. So let's get to it. So, let's start by watching me perform the NISC. Okay, so that is the NISC. Now let's break it down piece by piece. The first thing to note is that once I made it down the spiral staircase, I kept to the left. For me, this was the easier way to learn the NISC, but soon I'll show you how it looks coming in from the right, and for you it may be different. So I keep left and simply ride out my Ultra Mini Turbo, then I trick off this first ledge. Once I land, I try to line myself up so that I'm heading for the point where the border of these two arrow panels meet the edge of the ledge right here. I trick off that ledge as well, and note how I land on the darker gray border of the main road in a right drift. While this is the ideal landing spot, a bit of error to the right, and we may land in grass or bump the fence, which greatly reduces our success probability. You do have a little bit of wiggle room on the left, but it depends on the angle and location at which we jump off the ledge. While I recommend aiming for the point where the border of these rightmost arrow panels meet the ledge, I also recommend coming into that point at a slight angle. Instead of driving right over the border of these panels, I try to come in from the right side of the farther left of the two panels, still aiming for that point. This tends to put me at such an angle that, when I trick and land, I can do so in a right drift, then instantly kick my finger back out to the left to ensure that I am drifting as loosely as possible. From there, I simply keep an eye out for the grass on the left, and I try to just skim the dark gray border on that left side of the road. If you need to tighten your drift angle to do so, make sure to loosen it again as soon as possible. You'll want to keep your drift as loose as you can so that you don't hit the right-hand tower. Then, once I am through, I am ready to jump. I let go of the stick to enter a neutral drift, and then right after that, I release my mini turbo and hop. I stay in neutral position until I am basically right about to land. Then I tilt the stick to the right to angle my cart right, and I hop as soon as my cart hits the grass. If you do this at the optimal angle, you'll naturally be able to land off that hop into a left drift, and you can then just proceed as normal, because you've done this. Congratulations. Like I said earlier, half the challenge here comes from getting our driving lines correct, but the other half comes from jumping in neutral drift, and doing so at the proper time. The most helpful thing I can say for the latter is that you're going to want to jump earlier than you think. In reality, the difference between good timing and bad timing is probably a fraction of a second, but it does feel like you have to jump like a full second earlier than your instincts tell you to. Don't forget though, you will need to let go of your stick to enter into a neutral drift before you jump. If you are late on either, then you may get very little airtime and you will have to end up hopping through that whole stretch of grass, which will cost you some time. That's why, as usual, I suggest starting in time trials and just getting the field down before trying it out live against other racers. And getting your driving lines correct, while still a challenge, is somewhat more straightforward. At least at first. And this is because you can find an angle and approach to that ledge that works best for you, and then for the drifts, and then try to recreate it every time while you're learning. The ledge with the arrows gives a great visual indicator as to how you are lined up, and my earlier tips should help you get the line consistently. That being said, there is actually a little bit of wiggle room in how you can approach the ledge. Basically, if the point in which you jump off the ledge is to the left of that border I mentioned earlier between these two arrow panels, then you can still make this NISC work if you approach the ledge at a slightly more cutting angle. You may have to loosen or tighten your drift accordingly once landed, depending on how you came off the ledge, but the goal remains the same. You want to ensure that you aren't hitting too much grass or the wall on either side while aiming for the gap between the tree and the tower. This wiggle room is actually a really nice thing, because when racing online, there's no guarantee that you will always be able to come into this NISC exactly the same way every time. You might be getting bumped and pushed, there might be items flying around, etc. Plus, while I suggested keeping left after the spiral staircase while learning, it is best to be able to do it from both sides. Furthermore, once you have a good feel for the amount of wiggle room you have in approaching this NISC, you will gain the confidence to come into it more aggressively and with some faster strats. For example, as you can see here, I like to approach the shortcut while squeezing in as many mini turbos as I can, which I find easier to do coming in from the right side actually. But that being said, try to keep it consistent while you're still learning. Okay, finally, we have to quickly address that DEKU Baba that sprouts later in the race, like I said, about 2-ish laps in. As I showed earlier, you may be on a line that would normally be successful, but because of the DEKU Baba, you get chomped and lose time. Thus, when you know it will be there, after you jump, you will want to aim your cart left a little bit, then land and alignment hop right before entering your left drift. Avoiding this DEKU Baba does take a bit of practice, so again, be sure to do so, probably in time trials, before testing it out in competition. So, now that we have gone over this NISC pretty thoroughly, there are only a couple more things to address. First off, I want to show you about how much time this shortcut saves over swinging out like usual, so go ahead and watch. As you can see here, this cut actually does save a nice bit of time. Again, you aren't getting the items, but the time saved is often worth it, depending on the situation, of course. Now, finally, I want to spend just a little bit of time showing different clips of me taking this NISC, some coming in from the left, coming in from the right, during online races, etc. Just remember what I've taught you as you watch these clips, and think about how I am putting my own teachings into practice. Consider what you might have done had you been in my situation. Okay, roll the tape. Alright, so you probably saw that once you get comfortable with this NISC, you're able to come into it much less rigidly, and hopefully you got an idea for how you can take advantage of that wiggle room I mentioned earlier with respect to driving lines. Again though, as you are learning, it's probably going to be easier to just keep it consistent. But yeah, that's really all I have for you this lesson. Get out there and put your skills to the test by trying out this NISC. Practice, 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 and then go out and destroy your competition by getting first place after first place after first place. Alrighty, I look forward to the next class, but until then, take care and bye-bye.